My topic for today is going to be kind of a continuation of the earlier talk on end-to-end contribution. I will talk a bit of contributing to an AMP component and using sidebar as an example. But I'll mostly be focusing on more general information and tips useful for someone just starting on contribution, especially for different AMP components. And also, I want to note that a large portion of this presentation is taken from past talks. So if you guys already seen videos of those, then you probably already are familiar with a lot of the things that I'll be covering. In which case, great, but hopefully you'll still get something out of it. So first, a little background about myself. My name is Steven. I'm actually an intern here in the Mountain View office as part of the AMP UI working group. I've been there for the past couple months. And before that, I've really had no prior experience with AMP, so I was in pretty similar shoes in terms of being a new contributor. And in many ways, I'm still really new to the whole process and still have a lot to learn about. But so far, I think getting involved in contributing to AMP has already made me a better developer, just by virtue of doing things like conforming to the design principles that Alan has been talking about, being exposed to modern JavaScript patterns, as well as just writing code that's easily extensible and not a nuisance to look at. Oops. Getting used to the speakers. A little more context of what I've been working on. So part of the product initiative of AMP is supporting more complex navigational structures. Part of this means having a responsive menu experience like the one that's shown on the GIF. So on my part, parts of my project have included upgrading the existing version of sidebar to enable a nested menu experience as a subcomponent, as well as building a new component called AMP Mega Menu. So next, I'll talk about topics that are hopefully useful, whether you are making a new component from scratch, or if you're just updating an existing one and making changes that fit a certain bug or a feature request. So almost everything you work with on AMP will start with a GitHub issue. And as you can see from this fairly recent screenshot, there's definitely a ton to work with, about more than 1,400 issues. So a typical issue will look something like this. There's a brief description describing what the bug is. Next, some steps to reproduce it, ideally with a link to a demo. And if it's your first time or one of your first times contributing to an issue, it's always a good idea to kind of mention someone on the team so they can best direct you to the place to make the change. And one of the things that's very useful is having a minimal reproducible example in the issue. This can be done in many ways, using platforms such as Glitch or CodePen. And it just makes it really easy for someone looking at the issue to tell what exactly is the bug or the feature you want to implement. And also, if the bug has to deal with AMP list, it's also a good idea to host your JSON somewhere so that there is an endpoint you can easily fetch the data from. Another resource that I found really useful is called AMP Playground, and you can access it at playground.amp.dev. So the neat part about this is that, for example, you want to just play around with AMP or see what's out there. It's great because this has some really neat autocomplete and validation features that make it really easy for you to build a valid AMP page. All right, now let's say that you've already done some bug fixes and smaller features, and you feel great about yourself and say, oh, I have this really great idea of a feature that will make AMP 10 times more awesome. Now, the question is how can you proceed from there? So it's important to kind of step back first and see what are some of the best approaches. So first, maybe that feature is already possible in AMP by utilizing the existing tools. So as you can see, there are like more than 100 different AMP components, and sometimes a combination of 2 or more of them can achieve a certain feature. It's also another possibility is using bind with events and custom CSS, which can enable a realm of possibilities in terms of different functionalities. And another option here is extending an existing component. And finally, if you decide that it is indeed the best approach to create a new one, what you can do next is file an intent to implement issue, which you can find from the list here when you click on the new issue button on GitHub. This basically tells the AMP team that you have this idea, and we can start a dialogue on how to proceed from here, whether it's to start a design doc for it, go through design review, or simply get down to implementation. So next, speaking of implementation, here comes everyone's favorite part, probably. But first, it can always be daunting when you first start on an open source project. But AMP has some really great documentation that makes it much easier for new developers to like get up to speed on how to develop. And in this case, I found a really useful markdown file to be building an AMP extension, which covers a lot of topics that I'll be talking about in the next 10 minutes or so, and probably even more. So the first thing that we should get familiar with is the file structure. So almost all AMP components will live in separate folders inside AMP HTML/extensions. And here, as an example, you can see the basic file structure of amp-sidebar. So inside it, there are subfolders relating to each version of the extension. And inside each version, there is a main JavaScript file called amp-sidebar.js, as well as some like styling in CSS and testing in a testing folder. There's also a markdown file for documentation as well as validation as a proto-ASCII file. So next, we'll first take a look at this main JavaScript file, which is where most of the implementation will live. So first, the basic structure of a component.js file is composed as the following. I'll kind of go through these in the next few slides. So first of all, using sidebar as an example, we can see that it declares a class called amp-sidebar, and it extends the amp base element, which is almost always the case for different extensions. Next, it has a constructor that takes in an element and calls a super element, which is the base element's constructor. Inside the constructor, we also have a bunch of instance variables related to this class. And as you can see, for every property and method, we also have doc strings on top of that. That makes it easier for us to validate and check for the types of each instance variable to make it easier to debug. So the next thing after this will be overriding the component lifecycle methods. And there are quite a few of them. And to be honest, this is one of the things about AMP that definitely took me a while to digest. And it sometimes it will make me feel kind of like this inside when I first take a crack at it. But to be honest, like the good news is most components only need to override a few of these methods. And they are very well documented both online and inside the base element.js. So for our purpose, I'll just take a brief look at the most important ones that will most likely be overriding. But feel free to also check out documentation for this, since like it's always nice to take a look at it and refresh yourself. So first is build callback, and this is almost always overridden. It fires when the elements inside the component first became available, and you can use that to read in attributes set via markup. So for example, for sidebar, this might mean the side attribute. We can also use this to create the initial DOM structure, especially if you need any kind of DOM manipulation within your component. But one thing to note here is that we shouldn't do any heavy work or network requests, which kind of fall back to Alan's design principles. And then next up is layout callback. This is also frequently overridden. It's used to render like the final version of the element. And here we can actually do like some of the more expensive resources like iframe or video. And opposite to layout callback is, well, you guessed it, on layout callback. So this is called when the element is no longer laid out, and we can unload the previous heavyweight resources. This method also returns a Boolean that specifies whether the element needs relayout. So for example, if the return is true, then that means the element may fire layout callback in the future. Now, at the end of every main JavaScript file, we need to register the component. And this is actually very simple by simply calling amp.registerElement. And if there's custom CSS associated with that element, we should also import that and have that as an additional argument. Now, talking briefly about styling, there's very extensive information about that in writing css.md, especially about specificity that's worth a read. But for now, I think one of the main things I will highlight here is that anything that you write in, like any CSS classes, that you declare in this CSS file should be prefixed with either amp-html or just amp. So the first case is when you have a private class that you don't want publishers to customize. And the other case is when you have public classes that allow publishers to override. And the second case should be documented well in your Markdown file. All right, so now we have a wild Lego appearing on our slides. So there are a few things that make Legos great, but part of it is that it's actually one of the best cases of backwards compatibility. So likewise, I think when we edit an component, it's always good to keep in mind whether it's backward compatible, especially when you are updating an existing component, whether you are updating the attributes it supports or you're updating the CSS. And it's always good to keep in mind whether anything that you do can break other people's web pages through things like CSS selectors or DOM structure. And if you decide that, yes, it is absolutely necessary to have these changes, and there's no way to make them backward compatible, then it might be a good idea to upgrade the version of your component. And each AMP component will be versioned separately. And for more details, you can check out AMP versioning policy. So next up is experiments. Experiments is very useful when you have a large feature prior to release, and you want to kind of like control its release. And it's actually very simple to add also. Simply go to experiments.js, add an entry inside the experiments array with an ID that you define, some simple description, as well as a issue that you file to clean it up when it's no longer necessary. So next, to use that experiment, we simply import isExperimentOn, and we can use that as a conditional statement inside your main JavaScript file. to guard against any logic that you just implemented. And if you want to guard the whole component inside an experiment, you can do that to that. You can add that to build callback as a user assert. And let's say that you have a demo page you want to test, and you want to enable experiment for that page. It's very simple to do. Basically, go to dev console, type in amp.toggle experiment, and put in the ID of your experiment. All right, speaking of testing, this is another fun part that I'm sure everyone likes. So AMP has very extensive documentation about testing inside testing.md. For these slides, I'll mostly just cover some basics of unit testing. So first, AMP uses Mocha test framework for unit tests, and we should add test coverage for any functionality that the feature provides or the component provides. And to run a unit test, we can just simply put in the command gulp unit. And usually we don't want to run the whole test suite, which can take a while. So if we just want to test a specific test file, we can do add the flag files and put in the path of your file. So going into a bit more detail on unit tests, inside a test file, usually there's a before each, and the code inside that function will be executed before every test case. So usually this is a good point to kind of create your element, create your component that you're testing, and append that to the document body. You'll also notice here that I'm toggling that experiment on because this component is guarded by experiment, and we want to make sure that it's on before we test things. All right, next we'll take a look at an example test case. In this case, there's first a simple description of what we're testing, followed by a function using the async await pattern. So it waits for the element to build and layout to complete before proceeding to check on the thing we're testing. And you'll notice here that open is a method inside the sidebar component. But we can call that method here by using element.implementation. A couple other things that could be useful here is first it.skip, which skips the test case that you have skipped on. And as well as it.only, which when run, it will only test the case that has it.only. This is very useful if you are only interested in one specific test case in a very large test file. All right, neat. So let's say you have all the tests working and you feel really good about the feature you've implemented, and you build a demo page to showcase it. Next, how about how to deploy that change? So how to deploy that demo page so others can see it too and not just on your local host. There are many reasons for why you might want to do that. For example, if you want to do cross-browser testing or testing on different devices, as well as if you want to include a demo link on your pull request. So probably the easiest way to do this is through Firebase. So first, we would create a project on console.firebase. And assuming that you have the Firebase command line interface installed, you can then log into Firebase through command line, then do Firebase init, and basically follow the prompt. So we will select hosting. Then you can select the project you just created, or you can also select it later on. An important thing to know here is that for public directory, we want to select Firebase, and no for single page app. So the next thing is running gulp Firebase to actually build your project and copy the contents of that to the Firebase folder. There are actually a few flags I find really useful here. First is no build, which, as the name suggests, doesn't build So this is useful if you already run GOP and you already built a project. It saves a lot of time, so you don't have to do that again. Min builds the minify files, and if you want to just deploy a specific page, you can do file equals that page that you want to deploy. And then finally, we will run Firebase deploy. And then you can hopefully access your demo page now in firebaseapp.com under the project name that you specified. Next, let's talk briefly about validation. So a common complaint that we hear sometimes is that someone added a new attribute to a component, and now validation is failing. So first, let's take a look at why validation is necessary. So validation is actually a very powerful feature in AMP. It ensures that the pages that developers write are correct and well-formed. And it does so by asserting that attributes are used correctly in each component, that each component are using the supported layouts, as well as that the elements are placed in the right places as children or parents. So all this is done in the proto-ASCII file. And this is a very simplified version of example. But as you can see here, some things to note are there's an attributes parameter called adders that basically specifies what are the allowed attributes of a component. So for example, if you added a new component, a new attribute to a component, then you might want to add another adders with a name and allow values. Also, further down below, there is also AMP layout with the supported layouts that a component should enable. So if you're ever unclear of which layouts your component should support, it's always a good idea to kind of get in contact with the team and figure out together. All right, finally, so after updating the proto-ASCII file, we need to run the validator to update the validation tests. And we need to do so by doing gulp validate and with the flag update tests. But in order to do that, we need to first install Google and protobuf through pip. All right, last but not least is documentation. Documentation is important since, let's say you have this really great component, but no one really knows about it until you have documentation for it and allows users of the framework to know how to actually use your component. So this is done in the markdown file inside the component folder. And it should include things such as the behavior, attributes, events, actions, basically anything that user might find helpful when using your component. And basically, the more well-written your documentation is, the more likely it will be used by users of the framework. And by the way, this is just an example of amp-sidebar. And this is accessible at amp.dev under documentations and components. All right, this is the end of my presentation. I've included some links throughout the slides that I think could be useful when you're first starting on contributions. I just want to quickly add here that I think people on the AMP team are definitely some of the most helpful and passionate people I've met in the industry, the short time I've been in the industry. And I really highly encourage you to get in contact with anyone on the team when you encounter any kind of issues, questions, or have any ideas, either through GitHub or Slack. And yeah, I think so AMP is a great community, in my opinion, to kind of get started on open source. And I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.